Most people believe that the ego is their enemy, that it must be destroyed, silenced, or transcended, as if the only way to find peace is through the death of the self. You've heard it everywhere, in spiritual teachings, in motivational talks, and across the endless sea of self-help culture. Kill your ego. But what if this belief is wrong? What if the ego is not the villain of your inner life, but the most misunderstood part of your existence? Carl Gustav Jung, one of the greatest explorers of the human psyche, challenged this modern myth. He said the ego is not something to be killed, but something to be educated. It is not the source of your suffering, but the instrument through which you become conscious of your own being. The ego is what allows you to say, I am. It is the architect of identity, the center of awareness that gives structure to your thoughts, your choices, and your sense of reality. Without it, there would be no direction, no coherence, no capacity to live as an individual soul in a vast and uncertain world. But when the ego forgets its true purpose, when it ceases to be the bridge between your humanity and your deeper self, it becomes a tyrant. It begins to crave control, to seek validation, to defend its image at any cost. It lives for applause, for admiration, for acceptance. And in doing so, it imprisons you within a false identity, a mask carefully crafted to protect you from rejection and pain. You become what the world expects you to be, not what you truly are. And behind that mask, something sacred begins to fade. Jung called this distortion ego inflation, a state in which consciousness becomes obsessed with its own reflection and loses connection with the self, the true center of the psyche. In this state, life becomes performance. You live not to express yourself, but to maintain an image. You feel hollow, disconnected, and restless, trapped inside a story that no longer feels like yours. But the journey is not about destroying the ego. It is about transforming it. It is about teaching the ego to remember its rightful place, not as the ruler of your life, but as the servant of your soul. Because only when the ego serves the self can you begin to live with authenticity, purpose, and peace. To understand the power of the ego, we must first understand where it comes from. The ego is not born in a moment. It develops gradually, shaped by experience, memory, and emotion. From the first time you recognize your reflection in a mirror, the ego begins its work. It constructs a center, a sense of I, a voice that says, this is me, and that is the world. This separation is not a flaw of existence. It is the foundation of consciousness itself. Carl Jung saw the ego as the anchor of identity, the conscious core that allows you to navigate reality with coherence and direction. Through it, you build the story of who you are, your name, your beliefs, your dreams, your fears. It is the part of you that remembers, that plans, that decides. Without it, you would drift through life like a leaf in the wind, without memory, without meaning. The ego is the structure that makes existence stable. But this structure was never meant to be the whole of who you are. The ego is only the surface of a much greater ocean, a bridge between your outer world and the vast, mysterious inner depths Jung called the self. Its purpose is to translate the language of the unconscious into conscious awareness, to bring light into the unknown. In this sense, the ego is sacred. It is the vessel through which the soul expresses itself in time and space. However, the danger arises when the ego forgets its role as a servant and begins to believe it is the master. When the voice that was meant to represent you starts speaking for you, controlling every thought and feeling, desperate to prove its own worth. It becomes obsessed with control, terrified of failure, addicted to recognition. It loses its connection to the self, and in that disconnection, it begins to suffer. The healthy ego serves life. The inflated ego serves only itself. Jung taught that our task is not to abolish the ego but to refine it, to turn it from a wall into a window. Because when the ego remembers that it exists to serve something greater, it no longer stands in the way of your soul. It becomes the doorway to it. There is a point in the evolution of every psyche when the ego begins to believe it is the center of the universe. At first, this illusion feels powerful. You feel in control, confident, capable, even invincible. But slowly, imperceptibly, the ego starts feeding on the applause of others, and what once served life begins to consume it. This is what Carl Jung called ego inflation, a condition in which the conscious mind fuses with its own image and loses contact with the deeper self. When the ego inflates, it no longer acts as a bridge. It becomes a fortress. It isolates you from the unconscious, from authenticity, from the quiet truth of your being. You start to live through masks, carefully curated personas designed to impress, to protect, to survive. You become the achiever, the savior, the spiritual one, the strong one, roles that earn approval but drain the soul. Behind this surface confidence hides exhaustion, fear of exposure, and the gnawing sense that something real has been lost. In this state, life turns into performance. You no longer experience moments, you manage them. Every interaction becomes a negotiation for validation. And whenever reality challenges the image you've built, the ego responds with panic or rage, defending its territory at any cost. Criticism feels like an attack. Failure becomes an existential threat. You mistake the shattering of illusion for the shattering of self. Jung warned that when the ego expands beyond its proper limits, it commits the greatest psychological crime. It replaces the self. The servant takes the throne, and consciousness becomes enslaved to the image it created. He called this state ego possession. It is not that you have an ego, it's that the ego has you. You no longer live, you maintain a facade. And the irony is that this prison has no bars. Its walls are made of your own ideas about who you think you must be. To awaken from this possession is not easy. It requires humility, the courage to see how much of your life has been driven by fear and the need to appear strong. But this confrontation is sacred, because when the inflated ego finally collapses, what remains is not emptiness, but space. Space for the self to breathe again. There are moments in life when you surprise yourself. You say something cruel without meaning to. You overreact to a small criticism. You feel jealousy, rage, or shame rise up suddenly, as if some hidden part of you had seized control. And afterward, you whisper, "I don't know what came over me." But Carl Jung knew. He called it the complex, an autonomous fragment of the psyche that breaks free from conscious control. A complex is not just a thought or emotion. It is a miniature personality within you, built from unhealed experiences, old wounds, buried fears, forgotten humiliations. Each complex has its own energy, its own voice, its own agenda. When triggered, it hijacks your awareness and acts in your place. In that moment, the ego is no longer in command. It is possessed. You might think you are responding to the present, but in truth, you are reliving the past. Imagine the person who grew up being criticized, now reacting with fury at the slightest disapproval. Or the child who felt invisible, now desperate to be seen, endlessly performing for attention. These are not conscious choices. They are the echoes of unintegrated pain. And the ego, when fragile or inflated, becomes their perfect host. It represses what it cannot face, and in doing so, gives the shadow power over the light. Jung once said, "We do not have complexes, complexes have us." And he meant it literally. Each unacknowledged emotion forms its own identity, waiting for a moment to surface. This is why you can be kind and calm one day, and cold or defensive the next. Your psyche is not unified, it is fragmented. And until those fragments are brought into consciousness, they will continue to rule from the dark. But Jung did not see this as a curse. He saw it as an invitation to observe without judgment, to recognize the parts of yourself you've tried to exile, to name them, to listen to them, to integrate them. Because every complex holds a piece of your energy, a part of your life that was trapped in pain and now asks to be freed. This is the true work of depth psychology, not to destroy your darkness, but to reclaim it, to bring light into the forgotten rooms of your own soul. There is a strange pattern that repeats itself in almost every human life. Just when things begin to go well, when opportunities appear, when love seems possible, when growth feels within reach, something inside quietly resists. You hesitate, procrastinate, withdraw. You create reasons, excuses, distractions. And soon, what was once a moment of expansion collapses into disappointment. We call it self-sabotage, but beneath that name hides something far more intricate, a secret strategy of the ego. Carl Jung understood this mechanism with astonishing clarity. The ego, he said, is not designed to make you happy. It is designed to keep you safe. Its original purpose is survival. It learned to protect you in childhood, when love was conditional and mistakes carried punishment. It studied what pleased others and what provoked rejection. And from those lessons, it built its fortress, a personality crafted to avoid pain. That fortress may have saved you once, but as you grow, it becomes your cage. When the ego senses change, it senses danger. Growth means uncertainty. Authenticity means risk. And so, it defends its familiar patterns, even if those patterns destroy your joy. You dream of a better life, yet the moment you approach it, the old defenses awaken. Fear disguises itself as logic. Doubt wears the mask of realism. And the ego whispers, stay where it's safe. But this safety is an illusion. It is the comfort of repetition, not of peace. The ego would rather see you stuck in familiar suffering than exposed to the unknown. That is why so many people mistake control for strength, because the ego fears surrender more than failure. It would rather rule a small prison than serve in the vast kingdom of the self. This is why Jung said that real transformation begins only when the ego learns to trust something greater than itself. To master the ego is not to fight it, but to understand its fear, to see that every act of sabotage is an act of protection gone wrong. And when you meet that fear with awareness instead of resistance, you begin to free yourself from its control. Because the moment you see your own patterns clearly, they lose their power to define you. Carl Jung taught that true mastery of the ego is not achieved through domination or denial, but through relationship. The ego must not be crushed, it must be understood. To reach wholeness, consciousness must learn to hold the ego in dialogue with the self, the deeper center of the psyche. This process, Jung called individuation, the path toward becoming who you truly are. And within this journey lie three essential stages: the awakening, the witnessing, and the integration. The first stage is recognition. The moment you realize that much of what you call me is merely a collection of automatic reactions, old wounds, and inherited fears, you begin to see that the ego, which once seemed in control, is often being controlled. Here, awareness itself becomes revolutionary. You start asking difficult questions. Who is making this choice? Who is speaking through me? Is this a free decision or a reflex born of fear? This recognition is not comfortable, it is humbling. Because to awaken is to admit how often you have lived unconsciously. The second stage is observation without identification. This is where the real alchemy begins. You start to witness your emotions, your impulses, your thoughts, without merging with them. Instead of saying, I am angry, you say, there is anger in me. The difference is subtle, but profound. You create a space, a sacred pause, between stimulus and response. And within that space, freedom appears. This is the beginning of what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold the ego and the unconscious in awareness at the same time. The third stage is integration with the self. Here, the ego bows before something greater, not in defeat, but in cooperation. It begins to act as an instrument of the self, translating inner truth into outer expression. The ego stops fighting for power and starts serving purpose. It no longer needs to be perfect, admired, or right. It becomes real, grounded, humble, and strong. This is the moment Jung called authentic authority, when you no longer live from compulsion, but from coherence. Your actions are aligned with your essence. You no longer need to prove who you are, because you have finally met yourself. We live in an age that worships performance. Confidence is broadcasted, wisdom is curated, and identity has become a stage. Everyone is performing, louder, brighter, more certain, hoping to be seen as something significant. Yet beneath the noise, something essential has been forgotten: authentic authority. Carl Jung warned that when the ego seeks power for its own sake, it becomes a mask pretending to be the self. The modern ego is obsessed with image, with likes, status, and the illusion of control. It shouts not to express truth, but to silence its own insecurity. It demands attention because it fears invisibility. It chases admiration because it cannot yet love itself. And so, authority becomes performance. Charisma without depth, certainty without soul. True authority, Jung would say, cannot be performed. It emerges only when the ego bows to something greater, when it becomes transparent to the self. Such authority does not command. It invites. It does not intimidate. It illuminates. It carries a quiet gravity, the way a mountain commands respect without needing to move. The person who has faced their shadow, who has entered the depths of their own fear and limitation, no longer needs to dominate. They understand that leadership is not about control, but coherence. Their words carry power because they are rooted in experience, not opinion. They do not speak to impress. They speak to reveal. And when they stand in front of others, it is not their personality that captivates, but the light of authenticity shining through them. Modern culture teaches us to chase certainty, to never doubt, to appear strong at all times. But certainty is often the mask of fragility. Real authority includes doubt, humility, and the willingness to be wrong. It is born not from perfection, but from integration, the union of the proud and the broken, the light and the dark. As Jung wrote, I am not the whole, but I am an essential part in dialogue with the whole. To recognize that truth is to step out of illusion, to stop performing, and start participating in life itself. The false world is built on appearances, but the authentic person, grounded in inner truth, becomes a quiet disruption to that illusion. Their calmness exposes our frenzy. Their sincerity unmasks our pretensions. This is real power, not domination, but resonance. In a world addicted to noise, silence itself becomes revolutionary. And in that silence, the voice of the self can finally be heard. When the ego finally remembers its place, a deep stillness begins to unfold. It realizes that its endless struggle for control, recognition, and certainty was never the path to freedom. It was the cage. For so long, it fought to be seen, to be right, to be safe. But the more it fought, the more it lost connection with the living center of the psyche, the self. Jung taught that the ego's highest purpose is not to rule, but to serve. It is the conscious representative of the unconscious, the bridge between the infinite and the finite. When the ego submits to the self, it doesn't disappear, it transforms. It becomes a vessel through which deeper intelligence can move. This transformation does not arrive with thunder or revelation. It comes quietly, often through suffering. The breakdowns, the humiliations, the moments when identity collapses. These are the crucibles in which the proud ego is softened into humility. Through pain, the walls of illusion crumble, and something larger begins to move within us. The self does not speak in words. It speaks in symbols, in dreams, in synchronicities that call us toward wholeness. The task of the ego is to listen, to translate that mysterious language into conscious life. And each time it obeys that subtle whisper instead of its own fear, it becomes freer. This freedom is not the reckless independence of the inflated ego, but a sacred alignment. It shows up in small moments. the courage to be silent when provoked, the grace to accept when you once resisted, the honesty to say no when pleasing others once felt safer. Transformation looks ordinary from the outside, but inside it is a revolution. The ego learns devotion to the truth, to the process, to the self. It no longer needs to prove or to win. It simply participates in the unfolding of what is real. Wholeness, Jung said, is not about perfection. It is about inclusion, the integration of every fragment we once rejected. When the ego serves the self, even our wounds become sacred. The very places where we broke open become doorways to understanding. And so, the journey ends not in triumph, but in surrender, not the surrender of defeat, but of harmony. When the ego bows to the self, life stops being a battle and becomes a dialogue. The outer and inner worlds move together, guided by an unseen intelligence that needs no named in that quiet reconciliation. The soul remembers what it came here to do. We stop surviving. And finally, we begin to live.